Welcome back, everybody. I'm Travis with Linux Academy. In this lesson, we're going to start working with environment variables. Before we jump into this, I want to talk about the third principle in the 12-factor app, which is the config. The third principle states, apps sometimes store configs as constants in code. This is a violation of 12-factor, which requires strict separation of config from code. Config varies substantially across deploys, code does not. What we don't want to do is manage a bunch of configuration files that vary from environment to environment. We just want to use one. And this is where environment variables come in. For example, let's say I have an API key, and that API key is going to be different from development, staging, and production. When I go and deploy my container to development, I can specify the API key as an environment variable. So when that container comes online, it will use the API key that was specified for development. The same logic applies when I deploy my container to production. Instead of using the development API key, I specify the one that is for production. For the weather app, we do have a configuration file, but there is nothing that is environment specific. The API key that is being defined in the config, for the most part, is environment agnostic. However, there are a couple of environment variables I can go and set. The first one is the port. We'll be deploying out two containers, one for development and one for production, and each will be using a different port. I can also configure the node environment. For dev, we'll set it to development, and for production, we'll set it to production. So there's two ways we can use the environment variable with our build. First is at the command line. When we execute a Docker image build, we use the env flag to set the key value pair of the environment variable. The second way is by using the env instruction in the Docker file. And again, this is going to be a key value pair. When we use the env instruction, we're setting the default that the container will use. So let's go and take a look at the Docker file that we'll be creating. We have two environment variables which we'll be setting. Node env, which will be defaulted to development, and port, which will be defaulted to port 3000. So if we run a container using this image, if we don't change any of the defaults, the port will be defaulted to 3000 and the node environment will be production. Let's go ahead and get started. Navigate over to Docker images. We're going to create a new directory called env, and then go and navigate to that directory. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and clone the weather app source code. Next, we're going to create a new Docker file. Paste in the contents. It can be found in the description of this video. Okay, so let's talk about this file real quick. We're using Node as our base image. We have a label here. We've used it in the previous example. And then we have our two environment variables, node env, which we're setting to development by default, and then port, which we're setting to 3000 by default. And we'll be exposing the port that is defined in the port environment variable. And we do this by using $ and then the name of the environment variable. Let's go ahead and save and quit. Next, we'll go and build the weather app image. We're going to be executing a Docker image build -t. The name of the image is going to be Linux Academy /weather-app, and the tag for the image is going to be v2. Because the Docker file is located in the env directory, we're going to be using a period. If I wanted to go and change any of my environment variables, I could use the env flag. For example, node env. I could set it to equal production, and this would overwrite development. This means that any containers using this image, node env would be set to production. Okay, so the image is done building. We can go and list the images to make sure that our image is there. And it is right here. We have v2. To go and view what my environment variables are, I can execute a Docker image inspect on the image I just created. If you go and look for env, you can find the two environment variables that we supplied, node env and port. As you can see, by default, it's set to development, and port will be defaulted to 3000. Now we'll be deploying a development environment for the weather app using the image we just created. Execute a Docker container run. The image will be running in the background, so use the D flag. Name it weather dev, and we'll be mapping port 8082 over to 3001 on the container. In the port mapping, we've configured it to use 3001 on the container. Using the port environment variable, we'll be overwriting 3000 and set it to 3001. Because this container will be the dev environment, I don't need to go and change node env. Now go and list the containers. We want to make sure that our application is up and running. Okay, everything looks good. Let's go and curl the container. Execute curl localhost 8082. And remember, we changed the port mapping. By default, the exposed port is 3000, and we changed it to 3001. So by executing curl, we should get our results back to confirm that everything did map properly. And we do. So we did successfully change the port on the container. Now execute a Docker container inspect on WeatherDev to go and view the environment variables that were configured. And as you can see, port is set to 3001, and our node environment is still defaulted to development. Now it's time to go and deploy our production container. Execute a Docker container run, use the D flag, name the container weather-app2. Our port mapping is going to be 8083 to 3001 on the container. The first environment variable will be port, and we'll be setting it to 3001, just like what we did with the development container. Next, we'll be setting the node environment to production, and we'll be using the image that we previously built. Now let's go and inspect weather-app2. Our node environment is now set to production, and just like with the development container, the port is 3001. I should be able to curl localhost 8083, and everything is working. I add some additional logging to the weather app. When it goes and starts up, it's going to print out what port the application is bound to, and I can view the port binding by executing Docker container logs on weather-app2. Let's go and try this out. Execute Docker container logs weather-app2. You'll see that we're using port 3001. So let's create another version of the application. We're using the exact same image, Linux Academy weather-app v2, and the only environment variable that I'm going to be supplying is going to be node environment, setting it to production. Because we're not changing the port, it will be set to 3000, which is what is defined in the Docker file. This time, when I execute Docker container logs on weather prod, you'll see that the port is listening on 3000. By executing curl, we can verify that everything is functioning right for this container. And we are getting HTML back, so that means everything is working. To quickly recap, building on top of what we learned about the 12-factor app, we want to make sure that we use environment variables for configuration data. This way, we're not managing a bunch of configuration files based off of environments. We also learned how we can go and use the env instruction to set up environment variables in our Docker file. Then we learned how to change environment variables by using the env flag when executing a Docker container run. Coming up in the next lesson, we're going to start working with build arguments. Go ahead and mark this lesson complete.